To understand Carl Gustav Jung, we have to begin not with the famous doctor, not with the founder of analytical psychology, but with a strange, solitary child growing up in the parsonages of rural Switzerland. A boy who was convinced from a very early age that he was actually two people. Jung was born in 1875, the son of a pastor, into a household thick with the smell of old books and the murmur of half-finished prayers. But almost as soon as he could think, he sensed a split running through his own being. He called it later in life his personality number 1 and his personality number 2. Number 1 was the schoolboy, the son of the pastor, the awkward and often lonely child who did badly at gymnastics and well at daydreaming. Number 2 was something else entirely, an old man, ancient and dignified, who seemed to have lived for centuries, who was sceptical of the modern world, who felt an intimate kinship with the 18th century and with figures long dead. Jung wrote that this second personality would surface in moods, in dreams, and in a persistent, uncanny sense that his true self did not belong entirely to the time and place he had been born into. This is the seed from which everything else in his memoir grows. He was not interested, the way many autobiographers are, in cataloguing his achievements. He tells us plainly at the outset that his life is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious, and that everything else, his career, his marriage, his travels, are outer events, decorations on the surface of something deeper and stranger happening underneath. His childhood was steeped in what he would later call numinous experience, a word he borrowed to describe the feeling of the sacred, of something vast and other breaking into ordinary consciousness. As a small boy, he had a dream that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand, a dream of an underground chamber beneath a hole in a meadow, where he descended a stone staircase and found in a chamber lit by golden light a great phallic object enthroned like a king. He did not have the vocabulary as a child to understand what he had seen, but the dream never left him. He came to regard it as an early unbidden encounter with something he would spend his entire life trying to name, the deep structuring patterns of the psyche that exist prior to and beneath all personal experience. Even the natural world, the lake near his home, the mountains, the strange, worn stone he used to sit on as a boy, and wonder whether he was the stone dreaming. He was a boy, or the boy dreaming he was a stone. All of it vibrated for him with a significance that most adults have trained themselves not to notice. He was, by his own account, an unhappy and isolated student, better suited to solitary walks and private reading than to the company of other boys. He suffered from fainting spells that were later understood, at least in part, as a way of escaping the demands of school. When he realized, listening at a door, that his parents feared he was becoming a malingerer, something in him hardened, and he forced himself, through will alone, to overcome the fainting fits. He described this as his first real encounter with what he would call the will to individuation, the recognition that his life was his own responsibility, that no one else, not his father, not his teachers, was going to hand him the meaning he required. His father, a country pastor, is remembered in the book with a complicated tenderness. Jung loved him and pitied him. He watched a man who preached faith every Sunday privately wrestle with doubt, who clung to the letter of Scripture because he had lost, or never quite possessed, any living experience of the God he preached about. This became one of the central wounds and central questions of Jung's life, the difference between believing in God as a matter of doctrine and knowing God as a matter of direct psychological experience. He resolved, quietly and without telling anyone, that he would not make his father's mistake. If there was a God, or something that functioned like a God in the depths of the human soul, Jung intended to encounter it directly, whatever the cost. The chapters describing his childhood are suffused with the sense of a boy who felt fundamentally alone, not merely because he lacked friends, but because he seemed to be carrying inside himself an entire other world that no one around him could see. He describes carving a small mannequin out of wood and hiding it in a pencil case in the attic, along with a smooth oblong stone he had painted, as a kind of secret ritual object, a totem that comforted him in ways he could not explain and would not have dared explain to anyone. Decades later, studying anthropology, he would encounter descriptions of similar practices among indigenous peoples and feel a shock of recognition, the sense that as a boy he had independently rediscovered something ancient and universal, a fragment of what he would eventually call the collective unconscious. This is one of the recurring rhythms of the memoir. Jung experiences something privately and strangely as a child or a young man, and only much later, sometimes decades later, does he find the vocabulary or the comparative material to understand what had actually happened to him. The book is, in this sense, less a chronological account of a life than a slow act of retrospective interpretation. An old man looking back across the decades and finally being able to say what his earliest, strangest experiences had actually meant. By the time he left for university to study medicine, Jung had already decided that the boundary between religion and science, a boundary that so many of his contemporaries treated as an unbridgeable chasm, was in his own experience porous and uncertain. He had encountered something that felt sacred in a dream about an underground god, and something that felt scientific in his fascination with fossils, with the movement of the stars, with the mechanics of the body. He did not yet know how he would reconcile these things. He only knew, with the peculiar certainty of personality number 2, that his task in life would be to explore the border country between them, and that whatever answer he found would not come from a book or a professor, but from the same source that had given him the dream of the underground chamber in the first place, the unconscious itself, speaking in its own ancient and inexhaustible language. When Carl Jung enrolled to study medicine, he did so almost by accident of temperament rather than by any burning early ambition to be a doctor. He tells us that he had actually been torn between the humanities and the natural sciences, and that a dream tipped the balance, a dream in which he found himself excavating the bones of prehistoric animals from the earth, and understood upon waking that his path lay in the study of nature. But nature approached with the same wonder he had once reserved for the sacred. It was almost accidental, then, that during his medical training he picked up a textbook of psychiatry and felt, in his own words, his heart begin to pound. Psychiatry in the late 19th century was a disreputable, unglamorous branch of medicine. Associated with locked wards and hopeless cases, the last place an ambitious young doctor was expected to make his career. But reading that textbook, Jung understood in a flash that here, and only here, was a discipline where the two halves of his own divided nature, the scientific and the visionary, might finally be allowed to meet. Psychiatry was, he wrote, the only field of medicine that took seriously the question of what a human being actually is, the only field willing to treat the strange productions of the mind, the delusions, the hallucinations, the private mythologies of the insane, as data worth studying rather than nonsense to be dismissed. He took a post at the Berg Hölzli, the psychiatric hospital in Zurich, under the direction of Eugen, a decision his more conventional medical colleagues regarded as a kind of professional suicide. Jung describes those early years at the Berg Hölzli with real affection, the long nights on the wards, the case conferences, the slow patient labour of trying to actually listen to what psychotic patients were saying, rather than simply cataloguing their symptoms. He developed, during this period, his word association experiments, presenting patients and ordinary subjects alike with a list of stimulus words and timing their responses, watching for the telltale hesitations, blocks, and slips that revealed the presence of what he came to call complexes, clusters of emotionally charged material lodged in the unconscious mind, organised around some early wound or unresolved conflict capable of hijacking a person's thoughts, words, and behaviour without their conscious awareness. This was, for Jung, not merely an academic finding. It was experimental proof obtained under laboratory conditions that the unconscious was real, that it was structured, and that it could be studied with the same rigour as any other natural phenomenon. It gave him, for the first time, a scientific bridge between the dream world of his childhood and the exacting standards of the medical establishment he was now a part of. It was also during these Berg Hölzli years that Jung began to develop his lifelong conviction that psychiatric symptoms, even the most bizarre and seemingly meaningless ones, were not simply the debris of a malfunctioning brain, but were, in some sense, attempts at communication, attempts by the psyche to express something that could not otherwise find a voice. He tells the story of a female patient deep in a psychotic state who spoke what seemed to be complete gibberish, and how Jung, rather than dismissing her speech, took the trouble to sit with her, to learn the private logic of her associations, and discovered that what had looked like meaningless noise was in fact a coherent, if deeply strange, system of thought, built from fragments of mythology and religious imagery she could not possibly have encountered through ordinary education. This became one of the seeds of his later theory, that the deepest layers of the unconscious mind draw on a store of images and patterns common to all of humanity, appearing independently of a person's personal history or culture. He did not yet have the word archetype for this. That would come decades later, forged slowly out of thousands of hours spent at the bedsides of patients whom the rest of the medical establishment had already given up on trying to understand. Jung is careful in his memoir not to portray this period as one of unbroken triumph. He describes the loneliness of pursuing a line of research that his colleagues regarded with suspicion, the exhausting effort of maintaining a rigorous clinical practice while also nursing what he knew to be a set of intuitions that ran far ahead of anything he could yet prove. He also describes his marriage during this period to Emma Rauschenbach, a union that gave him a stable domestic base and eventually 5 children, even as his inner life continued to be pulled toward regions that had very little to do with domestic stability. There is an interesting tension running through these chapters between Jung, the responsible physician and family man, building a respectable career and a comfortable home, and Jung the visionary, who never stopped, even during his busiest clinical years, experiencing dreams and waking impressions of startling intensity, dreams he dutifully recorded and puzzled over long before he had any systematic theory to explain them. By the time he had established his own private practice and begun to gain an international reputation for his word association research, Jung had also become aware of a book that was, in Europe's small psychiatric circles, both revolutionary and radioactive, Sigmund Freud's interpretation of dreams. Jung read it and felt the shock of recognition that he had felt so many times before in his life, the sense that another mind had independently arrived at conclusions he had been groping toward in the dark. Freud's insistence that dreams were meaningful, that they could be interpreted, that the unconscious was not simply noise but a coherent system with its own grammar, resonated with everything Jung had learned from his patients and from his own inner life. He began a correspondence with the older man, and in 1907 travelled to Vienna to meet him in person. Jung describes that first meeting with an intensity that borders on the romantic, an initial conversation that lasted 13 uninterrupted hours. 2 men who felt for the first time in their professional lives that they had found someone capable of truly understanding them. Neither of them, at that first meeting, could have guessed how catastrophically and how instructively that friendship would eventually end, or how much of Jung's mature psychology would be forged in the wreckage of it. For 6 years, Carl Jung occupied a position that no one else would ever hold in the history of psychoanalysis, the position of Sigmund Freud's designated heir. Freud, 20 years Jung's senior, saw in the younger man something he desperately needed for the survival of his fledgling movement. A Gentile, a Swiss, a respected academic psychiatrist who could carry psychoanalysis beyond the small insular circle of Viennese Jewish intellectuals who had gathered around Freud in the movement's earliest and most embattled years. Jung, for his part, found in Freud something he had been missing since the death of his own father, a powerful older man whose intellectual courage and personal magnetism seemed, for a time, to answer every question Jung had been asking since childhood about the reality and the meaning of the unconscious mind. He describes in the memoir the sheer intellectual excitement of those years, the long, feverish conversations, the sense of standing together at the edge of a genuinely new understanding of the human mind, the founding of journals and societies, the first International Psychoanalytic Congress, at which Freud pressed Jung into the presidency of the new organization, publicly anointing him as the movement's future leader over the heads of Freud's own longtime Viennese followers. But even during these years of close collaboration, Jung records the first small fractures in the foundation, disagreements that seemed minor at the time, but that in retrospect revealed a fundamental divergence in how the 2 men understood the unconscious itself. Freud, for all his revolutionary courage, had staked the entire theoretical edifice of psychoanalysis on the primacy of sexuality, insisting that the deepest layer of the unconscious mind was organized around infantile sexual conflict, and that any deviation from this position represented a failure of nerve, a retreat into what he dismissively called occultism. Jung, whose own clinical experience with psychotic patients and whose own inner visionary life had convinced him that the unconscious contained material of a far stranger and more religious character than sexuality alone could explain, found himself increasingly unable to accept this narrowing of the theory. He describes a pivotal conversation in which Freud, gripping his arm, urged him never to abandon the sexual theory, because it was the one bulwark against what Freud called the black tide of occultism threatening to engulf psychoanalysis before it had even established itself as a legitimate science. Jung remembers being stunned by the almost religious intensity of Freud's insistence, the sense that Freud was defending not merely a scientific hypothesis, but something closer to an article of faith. And it was in this moment, he tells us, that he first understood that his relationship with Freud, whatever its warmth and however much he owed to it, would not be able to survive Jung's own intellectual honesty. The rupture, when it finally came, was not sudden, but was preceded by years of accumulating strain, culminating in the publication of Jung's own book on the psychology of the unconscious, in which he explicitly departed from Freud's exclusively sexual interpretation of libido, proposing instead that psychic energy was a more general life force capable of many forms of expression, only one of which was sexual. Freud experienced this departure as a betrayal, and the correspondence between the two men, once so warm, curdled into a series of increasingly formal and finally silent exchanges. Jung describes the dissolution of the friendship as one of the most painful passages of his adult life, made worse by the fact that the psychoanalytic movement itself, which Freud had built as much on personal loyalty as on scientific argument, effectively excommunicated Jung along with his ideas. He resigned the presidency of the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1914, and with that resignation, the golden period of his public career, the years when he had been groomed as psychoanalysis's crown prince, came to an abrupt and disorienting end. What makes this section of the memoir so remarkable is Jung's refusal, writing decades later as an old man, to simply cast the story as a straightforward tale of heroic independence triumphing over dogmatic orthodoxy. He is honest about how much the break cost him, not merely professionally, but psychologically. He describes entering, in the years immediately following the split, a period of profound inner disorientation, a sense of having lost his bearings entirely, cut off from the intellectual community that had given his work its context and its audience. He no longer knew, he tells us, what he actually believed, having defined himself for years in relation to a body of theory he could no longer fully accept, but without yet having anything coherent of his own to put in its place. He describes waking in the mornings with a heavy, nameless dread, and being unable to read a serious book, because everything he picked up seemed to dissolve into meaninglessness under the pressure of his own private crisis. In an intellectual culture that prized certainty and system building above almost everything else, Jung found himself, in his late 30s, at the height of what should have been his most productive and confident years, essentially having to start over, admitting to himself that he did not know who he was or what he was for. He is candid, too, about the strange, almost embarrassing methods he eventually adopted to try to find his way back to solid ground. Denied the comfort of an intellectual system, he decided, in a move that startled even himself, to return to a childhood pastime, building small structures out of stones and mud by the shore of the lake near his home, the same kind of building game he'd loved as a 10-year-old boy. He built miniature villages, churches and castles hour after hour, day after day, without any conscious idea of what he was doing or why, only a stubborn intuition that something in him needed this activity in order to move forward. It was through this humble, almost childish practice resumed by a distinguished middle-aged physician who had until recently been the heir apparent to the most important new movement in the history of psychology, that Jung began, slowly and without fanfare, to open the door onto the most extraordinary and dangerous period of his entire life, the years he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious. The years following the break with Freud, roughly from 1913 to 1917, form the molten core of Jung's entire memoir, and he devotes some of his most vivid and unguarded writing to describing them. He calls this period his confrontation with the unconscious, and he's unflinching about how close it brought him to what a less careful clinician might have diagnosed in another patient as a full psychotic break. It began with a series of overwhelming visions that intruded on his waking life, most famously a vision, recurring over several weeks in the autumn of 1913, of Europe drowned in a sea of blood, mountains of corpses, rivers running red, a catastrophe of such scale that Jung seriously wondered whether he was losing his mind. When the First World War broke out the following summer, he understood the vision retrospectively as a kind of premonitory perception, not a supernatural prophecy in any simple sense, but evidence that the unconscious, whether individual or collective, could somehow register and anticipate realities that conscious awareness had not yet caught up to. This conviction that the unconscious operates on a timescale, and with a scope far exceeding the individual ego, became one of the load-bearing pillars of everything he built afterward. Rather than suppress these visions or seek to medicate them away, Jung made the decision that would define the rest of his career. He chose to voluntarily and deliberately let himself sink into the material rising up from his own depths to treat his own psyche as a laboratory. He developed, out of sheer necessity, a technique he later called active imagination, disciplined method of engaging waking fantasy, allowing images to arise spontaneously and then interacting with them consciously, questioning the figures that appeared, taking their answers seriously, treating the entire process with the same rigor a scientist might apply to an experiment, while never losing his footing in ordinary reality, continuing to see patients, continuing to be a husband and father, deliberately keeping one foot anchored in the concrete responsibilities of his daily life, even as the other foot descended into imagery of ancient mythic intensity. He describes encountering, in these imaginal states, figures who seem to possess an autonomy and a wisdom, independent of his own conscious mind, most memorably, an old man he called Philemon, winged, bearded, moving through the air with the wings of a kingfisher, who spoke to Jung as though he were a wholly separate personality, dispensing insights Jung felt he could never have consciously invented himself. It was Philemon, more than any living teacher, who convinced Jung that the psyche contains contents that possess a genuine independence from the ego, contents that deserve to be approached not as symptoms to be cured, but as intelligences to be respected. He recorded these visions, dreams, and imaginative encounters obsessively during these years, filling notebooks he privately called his black books, material he would later transcribe, elaborate, and illuminate by hand into the extraordinary illuminated manuscript now known to the public as the Red Book, though in the memoir Jung discusses the substance of this material more than the object itself, since the book remained locked away from public view during his lifetime. He's honest about how frightening this period was for him and for his family. He describes moments of genuine fear that he might be overwhelmed entirely, that the psychotic patients he had spent years treating at the Berg Hölzli were not, after all, categorically different from himself, but were simply people who had been swept away by the same currents he was learning, with immense effort, to navigate deliberately. The difference, he came to believe, between his own experience and a psychotic breakdown was not the content of what appeared, since the imagery was often just as strange and mythic as anything he had heard from his most disturbed patients, but the manner of engaging with it, the discipline of staying in conscious relationship with the material rather than being swallowed by it. Central to this period was his encounter with a series of dreams and visions concerning a woman he came to call Salome, and a great black serpent, figures who appeared alongside the old man Philemon in a recurring inner drama that Jung interpreted, only much later, as his own encounter with what he would eventually name the anima, the unconscious feminine principle present, in his theory, within every man's psyche, and with other structuring patterns of the unconscious he would eventually call archetypes. At the time, however, he had no such vocabulary. He experienced these figures directly, as vivid, autonomous presences, and only gradually, through years of painstaking comparative research into mythology, religion, and the beliefs of so-called primitive peoples, was he able to recognize that the images rising up from his own troubled psyche in the middle of a Swiss winter bore a startling resemblance to imagery found in Gnostic texts, in alchemical manuscripts, in the myths of cultures he had never studied and had no ordinary way of knowing about. This recognition that his most private and terrifying inner experiences were, in fact, expressions of patterns shared across humanity and across history, transformed what might otherwise have been a purely personal breakdown into the empirical foundation of his mature psychology. He describes emerging from the most intense phase of this confrontation sometime around 1916 and 1917, changed in a way he could never fully put into words, carrying within him the conviction, tested now in the fire of his own experience rather than merely inherited from a professor or a textbook, that the unconscious was not a repository of repressed personal memories alone, as Freud had taught, but something vastly larger, older and more strange, a psychic inheritance shared by the entire species, capable of producing, in the right conditions, visions of terror and of transcendence in equal measure. Everything Jung would go on to build over the following 4 decades, his theory of archetypes, his study of alchemy, his exploration of religious symbolism across cultures, his concept of individuation as the lifelong task of integrating the conscious and unconscious halves of the personality, would be an attempt to give disciplined, communicable shape to what he had first encountered, alone, frightened, and largely without guidance, in those years immediately following his break with Freud. One of the most tender and unexpected threads running through Jung's memoir is his lifelong relationship with physical building, with stone, wood, and water, as a form of thinking that ran alongside and often ahead of his verbal and theoretical work. He tells us that even as a small boy he had loved to build, spending hours constructing tiny castles and villages from stones gathered by the lake, and that this building had a quality of seriousness to it that went beyond ordinary play, a sense that he was working something out, though he could not have said what. When, in his late 30s, deep in the disorientation following his break with Freud, he found that his adult intellectual tools had failed him entirely, that he could no longer think his way to solid ground through argument or theory. It was this childhood activity he instinctively returned to, building miniature towns of stone and mud on the shore, discovering to his own surprise that the practice loosened something in him, allowed fantasies and associations to surface that had been blocked by the sheer effort of conscious thinking. This return to building was not merely a temporary expedient. Decades later, in 1923, following the death of his mother, Jung began construction of what would become one of the most significant projects of his life, a stone tower at Bollingen on the shore of Lake Zurich, built initially as a simple round structure in the style of an African hut, and then expanded over the following decades, addition by addition, almost always in response to some inner necessity rather than any practical need for more space. He describes building a second tower-like structure after a period of restlessness following the death of his wife, and carving inscriptions and figures directly into the stone with his own hands, mixing his own mortar, working the material himself rather than delegating the labour entirely to professional masons, because the physical act of shaping stone was, for him, a form of meditation and self-expression as important as anything he wrote in his published books. He came, over the years, to think of Bollingen as a kind of three-dimensional autobiography, each addition to the tower corresponding to a stage in his own psychological development, so that the completed structure, uneven, asymmetrical, built up over decades rather than planned from a single blueprint, became for him a physical representation of the self, understood not as a fixed essence but as a process of continual organic growth. The most famous single object connected with this building project is the philosopher's stone Jung carved, a cube of stone into which he inscribed a series of Latin verses drawn from alchemical tradition along with a small figure he described as a homunculus, and on the fourth side of which, almost as an afterthought, appeared to him, while he was carving, the face of an old friend he had known in his student days, a face he had not consciously intended to depict at all. He tells this story of a face emerging unbidden from the stone under his own chisel, with the same matter-of-fact seriousness with which he narrates his most significant dreams, treating the incident not as a curiosity, but as further evidence that the unconscious does not restrict itself to sleep or to verbal fantasy, but can express itself directly through the hands, through craft, through the unplanned gesture of a tool against stone. This conviction that meaning could emerge through matter, and through making just as readily as through words, ran directly counter to the prevailing intellectual culture of his time, which tended to regard reason and language as the only legitimate vehicles of understanding. And it is one of the reasons Jung's mature psychology retained, throughout his life, a stubborn respect for craft, ritual, and physical practice that many of his more purely academic contemporaries found difficult to take seriously. At Bollingen, Jung lived without electricity or running water for much of his life, choosing deliberately to pump his own water, chop his own wood, and cook over an open fire, a way of living he described as bringing him closer to what he called the 2-million-year-old man that lives in all of us, the ancient instinctual layer of the human psyche that modern civilization, with its comforts and conveniences, tends to suppress and forget. He was explicit that the retreat to Bollingen was not simply a matter of rural nostalgia or a wealthy professional's country escape, but a deliberate psychological practice, a way of stripping away the layers of modern convenience in order to hear more clearly the older, quieter voices that industrial civilization tends to drown out. He describes long stretches of solitary time at the tower, tending a small garden, rowing on the lake, carving stone, during which he did some of his most important writing, and during which, he tells us, he felt able to be, more completely than anywhere else in his life, simply and entirely himself, personality number one and personality number two reconciled, for a few hours or days at a time, into a single undivided being. This theme of building as a form of psychological integration reaches its fullest expression in Jung's late reflections on what he called the process of individuation, the lifelong task, as he understood it, of bringing the conscious ego into a working relationship with the deeper, older, and larger unconscious self, a process he believed could never be completed once and for all, but only approached, asymptotically, through a lifetime of patient, often unglamorous work, much like the slow additive construction of the tower itself. He makes clear in the memoir that he did not regard Bollingen as a symbol he had consciously chosen to represent this idea, but rather as something closer to a natural growth, an outward manifestation that occurred more or less automatically as he pursued the deeper task of becoming who he actually was, stone by stone, decade by decade, in a place where the noise of the professional world could not quite reach him. Jung's memoir devotes surprising space to what most conventional scientific autobiographies of his era would have quietly omitted: his lifelong fascination with parapsychological phenomena, hauntings, premonitions, and the possibility that the boundary between mind and world is far less solid than modern rationalism assumes. He describes growing up in a household where his own mother displayed what he called a second personality at night, speaking in a voice and with an authority quite different from her ordinary daytime self, and recounts, without embarrassment, several incidents in which solid objects in his home behaved in ways that defied conventional explanation. Most famously, an occasion when a heavy walnut table split with a loud crack in the middle of the day for no discoverable physical reason, and another in which a bread knife in a drawer shattered into several pieces with a similar report. Incidents which Jung connected, tentatively and without any dogmatic insistence on their supernatural origin, to periods of intense unconscious tension within his own family. He was careful throughout these sections to describe himself as an empiricist rather than an occultist, insisting that his interest in these phenomena was never a matter of religious belief, but of simple attentiveness to a category of experience that mainstream science, in his view, dismissed prematurely rather than actually investigated. This same appetite for direct experience over inherited theory drove Jung in the 1920s to travel to places that most European intellectuals of his generation regarded purely as objects of anthropological study, rather than as sources of living wisdom worth encountering firsthand. In 1924 and 1925 he travelled to the American Southwest, where he spent time among the Pueblo peoples, and he recounts with particular warmth a conversation with a Taos elder named Biano, who told Jung that in his view white people were mad, restless, always wanting something, their faces cruel and their eyes staring, because, the elder explained, white people believed that they thought with their heads, whereas the Pueblo people knew that one thinks with the heart. Jung describes being profoundly shaken by this simple observation, recognizing in it a devastating critique of the entire rationalist, ego-centered civilization he had been raised in, a civilization that had, in his view, cut itself off from the participatory, embodied relationship with the world that traditional peoples still retained, and that this cutting off was itself a major source of the spiritual poverty and destructiveness he saw all around him in modern Europe. A few years later he travelled to East Africa, journeying into regions of Kenya and Uganda that had seen very little contact with European travellers, and he describes, with the vividness of a man recording the most important moments of his life, watching the sunrise over the African plain from a hilltop, observing a herd of animals moving in what appeared to him a silent, ancient, and utterly unself-conscious rhythm, and experiencing a feeling of stepping backward across enormous stretches of evolutionary and historical time, as though he were witnessing the world exactly as it must have appeared to the earliest human beings, before the invention of language, before the layering of civilization and abstraction had begun to separate humanity from direct participation in the life of nature. He also spent time observing and speaking with local peoples, and was struck again and again by a psychological wholeness and directness he felt was largely absent from the fragmented, anxious inner life of modern Europeans, though he was careful, even as he wrote decades later, to note the danger of romanticizing what he had seen, insisting that his interest was not in idealizing so-called primitive life, but in using the contrast to better understand what had been lost, psychologically, in the process Europe called progress. These travels were never simply tourism for Jung, and he is explicit in the memoir that he undertook them as a deliberate methodological choice, a way of testing his emerging theory of a collective unconscious, a layer of the psyche shared by all human beings regardless of culture, by directly encountering peoples whose conscious cultural inheritance was as different as possible from his own European Christian background, and observing whether the same patterns of symbol and myth that he had found in his patients' dreams, in his own visions, and in the historical study of Gnosticism and alchemy, would also appear among peoples who could have had no direct historical contact with those traditions. He believed, and reports finding substantial confirming evidence during these travels, that they did, that similar figures, similar structuring themes, mother and father images, hero narratives, symbols kept of death and rebirth, appeared again and again across cultures that had no plausible route of direct transmission from one to another, and he took this as powerful evidence that these patterns were not simply learned or culturally transmitted, but were, in some sense, built into the inherited structure of the human mind itself, expressions of what he called archetypes, the universal preformed matrices out of which individual and cultural mythologies are woven. Jung is also candid in these chapters about a persistent and troubling question that dogged him throughout his engagement with what he called primitive psychology, the question of whether by immersing himself so deeply and so sympathetically in what he understood as older, more collective and less individuated states of consciousness, he risked what he called going black, losing something of his own hard-won European individuality, becoming absorbed into a psychological state he associated with participation mystique, a term he borrowed to describe a state in which the boundary between the individual self and the surrounding group or environment becomes blurred or dissolved. He describes actively resisting this pull during his African travels, deliberately returning after his most intense periods of immersion to conscious reflection, to writing, to the disciplined work of interpretation, precisely because he believed that the value of his encounter with these older forms of consciousness lay not in simply losing himself in them, but in bringing what he learned back into conscious relationship with his own individuated, modern European identity, weaving the ancient and the contemporary together rather than choosing one over the other. This tension between the pull toward older, more collective forms of psychic life and the hard-won discipline of individual consciousness became one of the central and recurring themes of his mature psychological theory, and one he believed was becoming, in the 20th century, not merely a personal question for the occasional travelling psychiatrist, but an urgent and unavoidable question for an entire civilization, increasingly at risk, in his view, of being swept back into exactly the kind of mass, unindividuated psychological states that had already, in his own lifetime, produced war on a scale the world had never seen before. For years after his break with Freud, Jung found himself troubled by a nagging sense that the material rising up from his own confrontation with the unconscious, the strange figures, the mythic imagery, the recurring symbols of transformation, belonged to some larger historical tradition he had not yet identified, some body of human thought that had grappled seriously with these same patterns before him. He describes the moment this puzzle finally resolved itself as one of the great turning points of his intellectual life, a moment that arrived not through careful planning, but through what felt once again like a piece of good fortune arranged by forces beyond his conscious control. A Chinese scholar and translator sent him a manuscript of an ancient Taoist alchemical text, along with a request that Jung write a psychological commentary on it. And reading the text, Jung experienced the same electric shock of recognition he had felt reading Freud's interpretation of dreams decades earlier, the sense that a stranger, working in a completely different tradition, had somehow described exactly the inner landscape Jung had been mapping alone and half-blind for years. This led him, over the following months, into the obscure and at the time thoroughly disreputable field of European alchemy, a body of medieval and early modern texts that the scientific establishment of his day regarded as a historical curiosity at best, a superstitious dead end on the road to modern chemistry, worthy of no serious intellectual attention. Jung, however, approached the alchemical texts not as failed chemistry, but as a symbolic language, a kind of psychological encyclopedia in disguise, in which medieval practitioners, working in their laboratories to transform base metals into gold, were in fact unconsciously projecting the process of psychological transformation onto the physical materials in front of them, describing in the coded language of sulfur and mercury, of the nigredo and the philosopher's stone, exactly the process Jung had already begun to call individuation, the long, difficult work of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the personality into a more complete and stable whole. He spent years, deep into his 60s and 70s, tracking down obscure alchemical manuscripts, teaching himself enough Latin, and studying enough obscure iconography to work through material that had been almost entirely ignored by professional historians of science. And he describes this labour not as an antiquarian hobby, but as urgent, necessary work. The recovery of a lost historical confirmation for a theory of the psyche he had until then been forced to defend almost entirely on the basis of his own clinical experience. He recounts with evident satisfaction how this discovery finally gave him what he had been missing since his break with Freud, a sense of historical continuity, evidence that the strange symbolic material emerging from his own visions and from his patients' dreams was not an idiosyncratic personal aberration, but part of a current of human symbolic thought stretching back at least to late antiquity, surfacing again and again across centuries in different disguises: Gnostic cosmology, medieval alchemy, the dreams of 20th century Swiss patients who had never read a word of either tradition. This gave him, he tells us, the confidence to finally publish his ideas about the collective unconscious and the archetypes in their mature form, no longer merely reporting personal visions and clinical anecdotes, but building on what he now understood to be several thousand years of accumulated human testimony to the same underlying psychic realities. Among the many images that recur throughout Jung's memoir, none is treated with more reverence than the mandala, the circular design, often divided into 4 or some multiple of 4, that Jung encountered first in his own spontaneous drawings during the darkest years of his confrontation with the unconscious, and then, to his astonishment, in the religious art of cultures across the world that could have had no possible historical connection to one another: Tibetan Buddhist thangkas, the rose windows of medieval European cathedrals, the sand paintings of Native American ritual, the ground plans of ancient temples. He describes beginning to draw small circular images every morning during a particularly turbulent stretch of his inner crisis, without any conscious plan or aesthetic intention, simply as a way of giving external form to whatever inner state he found himself in that day, and noticing only gradually over months of this practice that the drawings seemed to trace an unmistakable developmental arc, moving through periods of fragmentation and asymmetry towards states of greater balance and wholeness, as though the drawings themselves were registering, more accurately than his conscious mind could, the actual condition of his own psychological integration. It was this experience, more than any purely theoretical consideration, that led Jung to his mature concept of the self, which he capitalized to distinguish it from the ordinary ego, describing it as the central organizing principle of the entire psyche, encompassing both conscious and unconscious, and representing not merely the personality a person is consciously aware of being, but the larger, more complete totality of what that person has the potential to become. He came to regard the mandala as the most natural and universal symbolic expression of this self, a circle representing wholeness, quartered or subdivided in a way that held opposing forces in balanced relationship around a stable center. And he found again and again, in the dreams and spontaneous drawings of his patients, that mandala-like images tended to appear at precisely those moments in a person's psychological development when some resolution of inner conflict, some new equilibrium between conscious and unconscious demands, was being achieved. He is careful in the memoir to insist that the value of these discoveries lay not in their exotic or mystical appeal, but in their empirical reliability. The fact that he found the same symbolic patterns appearing reliably across an enormous range of patients from different backgrounds and belief systems at psychologically comparable moments in their treatment, regardless of whether those patients had any conscious familiarity with mandala symbolism at all. This reliability, more than any single dramatic vision or coincidence, is what ultimately convinced Jung, and what he hoped would eventually convince a skeptical scientific establishment, that the unconscious mind operates according to genuine, discoverable structural principles, no less real for being symbolic and imagistic rather than mechanical, and that the human psyche possesses, built into its very architecture, an innate drive toward wholeness and self-realization that will express itself, given the chance, in images as old and as universal as the circle itself. No theme in Jung's memoir is more delicate or more likely to be misunderstood than his lifelong relationship with religion. He tells us plainly that he grew up surrounded by clergy, his father a pastor, several uncles also in the ministry, and that this immersion in institutional Christianity left him, from a very young age, with a peculiar and painful double vision, an intimate familiarity with religious language and ritual on the one hand, and a growing, almost unbearable sense that the men who spoke this language most fluently had, in most cases, no direct experience of the realities the language was supposed to point toward. He recounts a decisive early experience at around age 12, in which he found himself gripped by an unbidden and deeply distressing fantasy about God and a cathedral, a thought so shocking to his religious upbringing that he spent several agonizing days trying to suppress it before finally, in an act of what he later understood as courageous honesty, allowing the forbidden thought to complete itself in his mind. The relief and the sense of expanded understanding that followed convinced him that God, if the word meant anything at all, could not be confined within the polite, sanitized boundaries that respectable Protestant morality had constructed, but included, of psychological necessity, the terrifying and the transgressive alongside the comforting and the good. This early experience set the pattern for Jung's entire subsequent relationship with religious ideas. He did not, as some of his critics assumed, simply reject religion in favour of a materialist science, nor did he, as some of his more enthusiastic later followers assumed, quietly smuggle a private mysticism into what he presented publicly as clinical psychology. His actual position, laid out carefully across several chapters of the memoir, was that religious symbols and doctrines, across all the world's traditions, represented humanity's accumulated attempts to give conscious form to genuine, powerful, and objectively observable psychological realities, the archetypes of the collective unconscious, and that the question of whether God existed as a metaphysical entity independent of the human psyche was, in his professional capacity as an empirical scientist, a question he was simply not equipped to answer. What he could say, with confidence born of decades of clinical observation, was that the God image, the archetype of ultimate meaning and wholeness, was a real and functioning component of the human psyche, capable of producing effects in dreams, in visions, in the healing or the destruction of individual lives, whether or not any external metaphysical reality corresponded to it. He describes his own father's tragedy in these terms with particular sorrow. A man who had devoted his entire professional life to preaching a faith he had never been permitted, by the rigid theological training of his era, to actually and directly experience, so that in his final illness the elder Jung found himself tormented by doubts his profession had given him no honest way to express or resolve. Jung contrasts this with his own hard-won conviction, arrived at only through the terrifying detour of his confrontation with the unconscious, that one could not simply believe in the numinous, one had to encounter it, and that his entire life's work as a psychologist had been, in a sense, an attempt to build a bridge, a disciplined and honest method, by which modern people who had lost the naive faith of earlier centuries might nonetheless recover some form of direct psychological contact with the sacred, without having to either return to a literalism they could no longer honestly hold, or abandon the religious dimension of life altogether to a purely mechanistic and disenchanted view of existence. Toward the end of his life, this line of thinking culminated in one of his most controversial and personally significant late works, a book reflecting on the biblical story of Job, in which Jung dared to suggest that the God of the Hebrew Scriptures, as depicted in that story, displayed a moral immaturity, an unconsciousness of his own darker aspects, that stood in urgent need of resolution, and that the subsequent unfolding of religious history, culminating in the Christian doctrine of incarnation, could be understood psychologically as humanity's, and perhaps even divinity's own, attempt to integrate this shadow side into a more complete and conscious wholeness. He knew this argument would scandalize many of his more conventionally religious readers, and he says so directly in the memoir, but he insisted that his intention was never one of blasphemy or provocation, but of the same stubborn empirical honesty that had driven every other major turn in his career, an insistence on describing what he actually found in the depths of the human psyche, however uncomfortable that description might be for those who preferred their God to remain safely and simply good. Jung's memoir was written and revised during the final years of a life that had spanned 2 catastrophic world wars, and though the book is not primarily a political document, the darkness of the 20th century presses in on its pages with real weight, particularly in his reflections on what he called the shadow, the unacknowledged, disowned, and usually unflattering aspects of the personality that every individual and every collective group carries, but refuses to consciously recognize as belonging to itself. He describes watching, with a mixture of professional fascination and personal horror, the rise of Nazism in the country bordering his own, and he's candid in a way that cost him real reputational damage both during and after the war, about his early attempts to understand the psychological forces driving the movement, attempts that some critics later, not without some justice, accused of coming dangerously close to a kind of intellectual accommodation with the very forces he claimed to be diagnosing. He explains in his own defense that his interest in the psychological mechanisms of Nazism was never sympathetic but diagnostic, an attempt, consistent with everything else in his life's work, to understand a terrifying collective phenomenon using the same conceptual tools he had developed for understanding the individual psyche. He came to see the eruption of Nazi ideology as a modern instance of what he called psychic inflation on a mass scale, a situation in which an entire population, having lost its traditional religious and cultural containers for the darker, more violent, and more numinous energies of the collective unconscious, found itself possessed by an ancient Germanic god image he associated with Wotan, a god of storm frenzy and irrational compulsion, breaking loose from centuries of Christian repression and sweeping an entire nation into a state of mass psychosis that individual reason and individual conscience proved powerless to resist. Whether or not one accepts the specifics of this diagnosis, Jung intended it with complete seriousness, as evidence for his broader claim that the archetypal forces of the collective unconscious were not merely private therapeutic curiosities but historical forces of the first importance, capable, when a civilization lost its capacity to consciously integrate them, of producing catastrophes of exactly the magnitude the world had just witnessed. This experience deepened, rather than softened, Jung's insistence, expressed again and again throughout the memoir, that the integration of the shadow was not merely a matter of private psychological hygiene, useful for individuals seeking a better therapeutic outcome, but an urgent civilizational necessity. He argued that modern technological society, having achieved extraordinary mastery over the external world, had made no comparable progress in its capacity for inner self-knowledge, so that humanity now possessed, for the first time in its history, weapons and technologies of destruction fully capable of enacting, on a global scale, whatever unintegrated, unconscious darkness a given society happened to be carrying, without any corresponding growth in the collective wisdom or self-awareness needed to restrain that destructive potential. He considered this mismatch between outer technological power and inner psychological immaturity the single greatest danger facing the human species in the second half of the 20th century, greater even than the specific political ideologies that happened to be its most visible expression during his own lifetime, and he devoted much of his later writing and, by extension, much of the closing reflections of his memoir, to arguing that the only real remedy lay not in better external institutions or treaties alone, but in the difficult, patient, and irreducibly individual work of each person coming to terms with their own shadow, since a civilization, in his view, could ultimately be no more conscious than the individuals who composed it. One of the most extraordinary passages in the entire memoir concerns an event that occurred in 1944, when Jung, then in his late 60s, suffered a heart attack following a broken foot and came, by his own account and that of his attending physicians, close to death. During the period when he lay unconscious or barely conscious, hovering, as his doctor later told him, between life and death for a period of days, Jung experienced a series of visions of such vividness and coherence that he considered them, even decades later, among the most significant experiences of his entire life, more significant in some ways than anything that had happened to him in ordinary waking consciousness. He describes finding himself in this state floating high above the surface of the earth, able to see the curvature of the planet beneath him, the deep blue of the ocean, the outline of continents, an image of the earth from space that Jung recorded years before any human being had actually travelled far enough to see such a sight with their physical eyes. He describes a floating temple carved into a great block of stone, an approach toward what felt to him like a threshold of ultimate meaning, and a profound and overwhelming sense that everything in his life, every question he had ever asked, every struggle he had ever undergone, was, in this state, finally and completely resolved, that he was approaching a condition of understanding so complete that all his former concerns seemed, in retrospect, almost laughably provisional and small. Jung is careful to state that he experienced this vision not as a dream, and not as a hallucination in the ordinary clinical sense, but as a state of consciousness, at least as objectively real and coherent as ordinary waking life, if not more so. He records his own reluctance and even resentment upon being told, once his physical condition began to stabilize, that he would in fact recover, describing a distinct sense of disappointment that the process he had experienced as an approach towards some ultimate completion was going to be interrupted, and that he would have to return to what now felt, by contrast, like the comparatively confining and unfinished business of ordinary embodied existence. He recovered slowly over the following months, and he tells us that his entire relationship to his remaining years of life was permanently altered by what he had experienced, a new equanimity in the face of the prospect of his own eventual death, alongside a renewed and even more urgent sense of purpose regarding the psychological and scholarly work he still had left to complete. He is scrupulously honest in recounting this material about the impossibility of proving anything definitive from it. He does not claim that his 1944 visions constitute evidence for a literal afterlife in any doctrinal or religious sense, and he explicitly warns his readers against drawing overly simple conclusions from what remains. After all, a single subjective and unrepeatable experience undergone by a man in a state of severe physical crisis. What he does insist upon, with the same stubborn empirical seriousness that runs through every other chapter of the memoir, is that the experience was psychologically real and significant regardless of its ultimate metaphysical status. That it demonstrated, at least to his own satisfaction, the existence of psychic capacities and states of consciousness far exceeding what ordinary, healthy, waking awareness typically registers, and that questions about the survival of consciousness beyond bodily death, questions that a purely materialist science of his era was inclined to dismiss out of hand as unanswerable, and therefore not worth asking, deserved, in his view, to be approached with the same open, careful, empirical curiosity he had tried to bring to every other unusual phenomenon he had encountered across his long career. The final chapters of Jung's memoir turn, with a candour unusual for a man of his generation and professional standing, to the specific psychological tasks of old age, and to his own gradual, often difficult accommodation with the approach of death. He describes with characteristic honesty that the loss of his wife Emma in 1955, after more than 50 years of marriage, left him for a time profoundly disoriented, grieving not merely the loss of a companion but the loss of a particular irreplaceable form of intimate understanding that had developed between them over the course of half a century, an understanding, he notes with some regret, that he had not always sufficiently appreciated or nurtured during the more restless and inwardly turbulent decades of his career, when the demands of his research and his patients had often taken priority over the ordinary claims of domestic partnership. He writes about the particular loneliness of surviving into extreme old age, watching most of the friends, colleagues and rivals who had populated the great intellectual dramas of his younger years, Freud among them, precede him into death, so that by his final years he found himself one of the last living witnesses to the entire founding period of modern depth psychology, a position that brought with it both a kind of authority and a profound solitude. He describes his old age not as a period of decline to be endured, but, consistent with everything else in his psychological theory, as a distinct and necessary stage of the individuation process, one with its own specific developmental tasks that differ sharply from those of youth and middle age, where the first half of life, in his view, was properly concerned with the tasks of establishing oneself in the outer world, building a career, a family, a social identity. The second half of life, and especially old age, was properly concerned with an inward turning, a gradual withdrawal of psychic investment from external achievement and toward the deeper work of coming to terms with the teiyaku, the totality of one's own life and personality, integrating what had been left unintegrated, making peace with what could not now be changed, and preparing psychologically for the final and most radical transition of all. He is candid that this preparation was not, for him, a matter of any conventional religious comfort or doctrinal certainty about an afterlife, but rather a continuation of the same disciplined attentiveness to his own dreams and inner experience that had characterized his entire adult life, an attentiveness that, in his final years, increasingly focused itself on questions of ultimate meaning, of what, if anything, survived or mattered beyond the boundary of an individual human lifespan. Perhaps the most quietly moving passages in this section of the memoir concern Jung's continued dream life in extreme old age, dreams he continued to record and to reflect upon with the same rigour he had applied to his very earliest recorded dreams as a young man decades before. He describes dreams during these final years that seemed to him to carry a distinctly valedictory quality, images of completion, of settling accounts, of preparing for a journey, and he treats these late dreams with the same seriousness and the same refusal to impose premature or comforting interpretations that he had insisted upon throughout his entire career, allowing the images to speak as far as possible in their own terms, rather than forcing them into a predetermined framework of consolation. He writes, toward the very end of the book, of arriving at a hard-won equanimity regarding his own mortality, not because he had achieved any final certainty about what, if anything, awaited him beyond death, but because he had, through decades of patient attention to his own inner life, achieved something he considered far more valuable than certainty, namely the conviction that he had lived, as fully and as honestly as he was able, the singular and irreplaceable life that had been given to him, and that this, in the end, was the only preparation for death that had ever actually been within his power to make. If there is a single thread that ties together the entire sprawling arc of Jung's memoir, from the small boy carving a mannequin in a Swiss attic to the old man reflecting on his own approaching death at Bollingen, it is his unwavering trust in the dream as a reliable, if difficult to decode, source of psychological guidance. He tells us that he began recording his own dreams systematically from a very young age, long before he had any theoretical framework for interpreting them, and that he continued this practice without significant interruption for the remainder of his life, so that by the time he came to write his memoir, he possessed a body of personal dream material spanning more than 7 decades, a resource he treated with the same seriousness a naturalist might bring to a lifetime of field notes on a single, endlessly complex ecosystem. Where Freud had tended to treat dreams primarily as disguised expressions of repressed infantile wishes, a code to be cracked and reduced to a small number of recurring themes, Jung insisted, on the basis of this vast personal and clinical archive, that dreams were better understood as compensatory, spontaneous productions of the psyche, often pointing not backward toward repressed childhood material but forward towards psychological tasks and possibilities the dreamer's conscious mind had not yet recognized or accepted. He illustrates this conviction with numerous examples drawn from his own life, describing occasions on which a dream arrived at a moment of significant personal or professional decision, offering him an image or a piece of guidance that ran directly counter to what his conscious, rational deliberation had been inclined to conclude, and describing his own growing willingness over the decades to take such dreams seriously as a genuine second source of counsel alongside ordinary conscious reasoning rather than dismissing them as mere noise. He is careful throughout to insist that this was never a matter of superstitious dream divination, of treating every image as a literal prophecy or command to be mechanically obeyed. Rather, he describes a patient, disciplined practice of what he called amplification, placing a given dream image alongside comparative material drawn from mythology, religion, and the dreamer's own personal associations, in order to gradually draw out the range of meanings the image might plausibly carry. A practice requiring, in his view, as much intellectual rigour and as much resistance to premature, comforting interpretation as any other serious scholarly discipline. He devotes particular attention, in these later reflections, to a series of dreams occurring at pivotal transitions across his own life. A childhood dream of the underground god that first opened him to the numinous dimension of experience, dreams during his crisis years following the break with Freud that guided him, step by uncertain step, toward the practice of active imagination, and dreams in his final years that seemed, to his own reading, to be preparing him consciously for the final transition of death. He treats this continuous, decades-long dialogue with his own dream life not as a private eccentricity, but as the central methodological achievement of his entire career, the disciplined, sustained attention that allowed him to develop, out of raw personal experience, a body of psychological theory he believed could be of genuine use to others navigating their own inner lives. He notes, with something like wonder even at the very end of his long life, that the dreams never stopped coming, that even in his final years, the same tireless, inventive, and often startlingly wise process that had produced his very first recorded childhood dream continued, without any sign of exhaustion, to generate new images, new questions, and new sources of unexpected insight, as though the unconscious itself, unlike the conscious mind it accompanied throughout an entire human lifetime, carried within it an inexhaustible and evidently ageless creative vitality. Jung reflects in the closing sections of his memoir with evident ambivalence on the strange fate that had befallen him in his later years, the transformation of a working clinical psychiatrist who had spent decades quietly seeing patients and slowly developing his theories in relative professional isolation, into something closer to a public sage, sought out by visitors from around the world eager for his views, not merely on psychology but on religion, on the fate of civilization, on the meaning of life itself. He describes this development with a curious mixture of gratification and discomfort, gratified that ideas he had developed largely alone and often against considerable professional hostility had eventually found a wide and appreciative audience, but uncomfortable with the tendency of some among that audience to treat him as a guru or a prophet, a role he explicitly and repeatedly disclaims throughout the memoir, insisting that he considered himself, first and last, an empirical scientist attempting to describe what he had actually observed in the psyches of his patients and in his own inner life, rather than the founder of a new religion or a dispenser of ready-made wisdom. He addresses directly and with some evident weariness the accusation, levelled against him by certain critics both during his lifetime and afterward, that his psychology represented an unscientific retreat into mysticism, a charge he had first encountered from Freud himself decades earlier, and that continued to dog him throughout his career. His response, consistent across the memoir, is to insist that the accusation rests on a category error, a confusion between the metaphysical question of whether God, spirits, or an afterlife actually exist as objective realities independent of human minds, a question he repeatedly states lies entirely outside the competence of psychology to answer, and the entirely separate empirical question of whether the human psyche produces, reliably and observably, experiences and images with a religious or numinous character, a question he insists can be and was investigated with the same rigour as any other clinical phenomenon. He notes with some irony that this distinction, though he considered it perfectly straightforward, was persistently misunderstood or ignored by critics on both sides, by materialist scientists who accused him of smuggling religion into psychology, and by religious believers who accused him of reducing their faith to a mere psychological phenomenon, when his actual claim, as he understood it, was considerably more modest and, he believed, more defensible than either camp assumed. He reflects too on the international movement that had grown up around his ideas by the time he wrote his memoir, the training institutes established in his name, the analysts trained in his methods now practicing across Europe and the Americas, and he expresses a characteristically mixed set of feelings about this institutional legacy, pride that his life's work had produced a durable and growing body of practice capable of helping people navigate their own psychological development long after he himself would be gone, alongside a persistent worry, expressed more than once in the closing pages, that institutionalization inevitably risks calcifying what had been, in his own life, a living, constantly evolving process of discovery into a fixed doctrine, a worry that led him to repeatedly urge his own students and followers not to become Jungians in any narrow dogmatic sense, but to use his ideas only as a stimulus and a starting point for their own independent confrontation with their own unconscious, in exactly the same spirit of restless, empirical curiosity that had driven his own life's work from its very beginning. In the final pages of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Carl Jung steps back from the specific episodes of his long and unusual life to offer something closer to a summary judgment on the entire enterprise, and what he offers is not a triumphant declaration of certainty, but a carefully qualified statement of the single conviction he felt he could stand behind after nearly 80 years of relentless self-examination, that every human life is, whether or not the person living it ever recognizes the fact, an unfolding myth, a story told not by the conscious ego alone but by the deeper, older, and largely invisible layers of the psyche working through it, and that the task of a genuinely lived life, as distinct from a merely survived one, is to bring as much of that hidden myth as possible into conscious awareness before death arrives to close the book. He states plainly that he cannot know, and does not pretend to know, what if anything awaits a person after death, and he is unwilling, even at the very end of his own life, to offer his readers the comfort of a definite answer to a question he had spent decades circling without ever claiming to have resolved. What he offers instead, and what gives the memoir's closing pages their peculiar and lasting power, is his own hard-won sense of what it had actually meant, in practice, to try to live his own myth honestly, rather than to live according to some borrowed and ill-fitting script inherited from his family, his profession, or the expectations of his era. He reflects on how much of his early adult life had been shaped by ambitions and identities that were not, in the end, fully his own. The promising young physician, the heir apparent to Freud, the respected academic, and how the crisis that followed the collapse of that early identity, painful and frightening as it had been at the time, had ultimately forced him into a far more authentic relationship with his own, particular, irreplaceable inner life than he might ever have achieved if his early career had simply continued along its initially charted course. He suggests, without insisting that his own path is a template for anyone else, that a comparable crisis, a forced encounter with the parts of oneself that conventional ambition and social expectation have no room for, may be a necessary passage for anyone seeking to live, in his sense of the word, a genuinely individuated rather than a merely successful life. He closes the book with a series of reflections on the sheer strangeness and improbability of individual consciousness itself, marvelling that out of the vast, silent, largely unconscious material universe, a small, temporary and fantastically improbable arrangement of matter had somehow given rise to a being capable of looking back at that universe and asking what it all meant, capable of dreaming of building stone towers by lakes, of carving alchemical inscriptions, of travelling to distant continents in search of older forms of wisdom, of loving and losing a wife for 50 years, of nearly dying and glimpsing in that near-death state an image of the Earth as seen from beyond it decades before any human being would actually travel far enough into space to confirm the accuracy of the vision. He does not resolve this sense of cosmic strangeness into any final systematic philosophy. He seems, in these last pages, to have arrived after everything at a place very close to where he began as a solitary, watchful child by the shore of a Swiss lake, sensing that something vast and meaningful moved beneath the ordinary surface of things, without ever being able, or perhaps even wanting, to reduce that vastness to a set of tidy propositions. The book ends, fittingly for a man who had spent his entire professional life listening more carefully to silence and to image than to argument, not with a grand theoretical conclusion, but with a quiet, almost understated acknowledgement that he had done what he could, that he had followed as faithfully as he was able the strange, demanding, and often frightening guidance offered to him across nearly 8 decades by his own dreams, visions, and inner voices, and that whatever judgment history or eternity might eventually pass on the value of that lifelong labour, he could at least say, without illusion and without excessive pride, that he had lived his own myth rather than someone else's, that he had gone, as far as any human being reasonably can, into the depths of his own particular darkness in search of whatever light might be found there, and that in the end, having done this work as honestly as he knew how, he found himself able to face the approaching silence, not with triumphant certainty, but with something quieter and in its own way more durable, an old man's hard-earned peace with the vast and finally unanswerable mystery of having been, for a brief span of years, alive.